So you see how in an ironic and strange way, the history of Armenians was tied to what is now the capital of Baku. When Baku became Soviet, the regime there, which for a long time was also led by an Armenian named Mirzoyev, also the head of the Communist Party was for a time an Armenian in Azerbaijan. These are strange multinational, internationalist histories. A monument was built to the 26 commissars, their remains brought back from Central Asia in what I think was called Freedom Square at the time. Don't quote me on that. When Azerbaijan became an independent country and the Aliyev family took over, they dug up those remains, and scattered them, desecrating the grave of these 26 commissars in order to erase the memory of the 20th century, of a century in which there was Soviet power and there was a different understanding of how people could live together. See? So we're back to chauvinistic nationalisms in the republics to the detriment of the kind of internationalist fervor and fever and understanding that for a moment reigned during the year of revolution.
And welcome to the Other Armenias podcast. I am your co-host, Milena Abrahamian.
And I am your other co-host, Tamar Shirinyan.
So today we have a really interesting guest on, but before we introduce him, I just want to remind everyone, please subscribe, follow, like. As you know, we are on YouTube, we are on all platforms that podcasts are available except Spotify. So follow us there, rate us, interact with us, leave us some comments. We'd be happy to hear from you. So I would love to introduce the guest that we have on today. Ronald Grigor Suny is William H. Sewell Distinguished University Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Michigan, Emeritus Professor of Political Science and History at the University of Chicago, and the author of the Baku Commune, 1917-1918, The Making of the Georgian Nation, Looking Toward Ararat, Armenia in Modern History, The Revenge of the Past, Nationalism, Revolution and the Collapse of the Soviet Union, The Soviet Experiment, Russia, the USSR, and the Successor States, They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else, A History of the Armenian Genocide, co-author of Russia's Empires, and co-editor of A Question of Genocide, Armenians and Turks at the End of the Ottoman Empire, and most recently of Stalin, Passage to Revolution. Wow, what a bio, Ronald. Welcome.
Thank you.
Lovely to have you. So, kicking off the first question, how much?
Yeah, so I think what we want to talk about today, of course, you have written so many books and you have had so much important and interesting insight into Armenian history, into Soviet history. But I would like to, really focus on this book, which is your first book, The Baku Commune. Because I think this is one of the, and I could be wrong, but this is one of the less known parts of what falls squarely into Armenian history. And so I think we should amplify it and talk about this history, which of course you are the most qualified person to do, having literally written the book on it. So can you first tell our listeners a little bit about what the Baku Commune was?
So the Baku Commune was a organization, or let's say a formulation of control of the city of Baku, the oil capital of the Russian Empire, in the year 1914, 1917, 1918. And it was an event in which a relatively small party, the Bolsheviks, or later the Communist Party, took over the city in alliance with a very much more powerful in some ways Armenian political party, the Dashtnak Nationalist Socialist Party. And together they, for a few months, ruled the city until they stepped down from power, the leaders of that commune, and eventually they were murdered by anti-Bolsheviks in Central Asia. So it's a very interesting year and a half that I studied to study largely and look at the revolution at a local level, that is from the ground up, and outside of the major political centers, namely Petrograd and Moscow.
So, why did you want to write your dissertation? And so, it is a book that was published out of your dissertation, which this took a whole lot of research. It required research in the Soviet Union at a time during the Iron Curtain. So why were you interested in this topic enough to want to choose it as your topic for your dissertation?
So the actual event of choosing the topic was almost an accident. It I was a graduate student at Columbia. It was my uh, third year of working, and we had been assigned to come in the following week with a topic for a dissertation. This was done quite informally, and I didn't do the assignment. And as they were going around the room, I had to decide what to write on. And I was a little confused. But by the time they got to me, I had thought about something. I had come across the name of an Armenian Bolshevik, Stepan Shaumyan, when reading a very important book at the time, Three Who Made a Revolution, by a former communist named Bertram Wolfe. And I wondered who this guy was. And he discussed Shaumyan as a kind of rival to Stalin. So this was interesting to me. And Shaumyan had been the leader of the Bolsheviks in the Caucasus and the leader of this Baku Commune. So I suggested this as a topic, rather rashly, not realizing that for the next 10 years of my life, I would be focused on these events and they would have enormous consequences for my further career. So there I was, a young Armenian scholar in America, American Armenian scholar, born as an American, of course. And I was at the time learning Russian and learning Armenian. I hadn't yet started Turkish or Georgian, but that would come later. And I needed to do this research. So I preliminarily did some research and I got luckily appointed to go on the official American-Soviet exchange program. You couldn't really do this kind of work unless you got to the Soviet Union, and there were only about 25 people selected every year to go on this thing. So I was appointed. I had to go through certain hoops. I had been in Armenia and Baku the year before, visiting relatives in Baku and in Tashkent. And there were people who I think would have preferred that I not go. I was questioned by certain intelligence authorities about my associations and all. But eventually, with help from my mentors, particularly a man named Henry Roberts, a very distinguished historian of Romania, I got to go. So I arrived in Moscow in the fall of 1965 and began to work there. And it wasn't particularly fruitful in Moscow. There were some archives open and things. I was finding stuff, reading secondary material. But I was then allowed in the winter of 1966, January through March or April, to go down to Yerevan. And there I was permitted to work in the Institute of Marxism-Leninism, which was a small institute connected to the Communist Party that had all of the newspapers from the year of this revolution in Baku, in Russian, in Armenian, in Azeri, etc., and of all the parties. And those newspapers became my archive because the actual archive of the Baku Commune, whatever records had existed, had been burnt and incinerated when the Turkish army, the Ottoman army, took the city of Baku in September of 1918. So there I was every morning going to this little archive, living in a dormitory, Handargitsaran on Lenini Pogots, Lenini Pogodan, and working in this archive. And it was incredible. And they were allowing me to read all these things, some of which Soviet scholars were not really fully permitted to see, though I was treated as a special guest, etc. And they even said you can work in the archives. It was a bit late to do that. I was not allowed, and I tried after working in Yerevan to go to Baku and work there. I had an aunt in Baku. They would not allow me into the archives. So I went back to Moscow. The Soviets in Moscow said, "Oh, they have to let you in. We'll send you back." But I said, "I actually have enough material I need to start writing up." So that was the basis of the research I did. And
what was the reasoning for, or was there reasoning for why you weren't allowed to go to Baku?
Not allowed into the archive. I didn't have the right documents, and the Azerbaijanis were not willing to facilitate it. I actually went to the archive, which was named after Shaumyan, knocked on the door innocently, 26-year-old kid, 25-year-old kid, and they said, no, we can't let you in. I would have had to go back to Moscow. It was very important in Soviet times to have the right documents, the удостоверение or the разрешение or whatever this piece of paper was. So it would have meant back and forth by plane, by train, whatever. And so I didn't do that. And I visited with my aunt. We talked. I learned a lot about the events. I saw the city. I kind of did field work in the city in terms of seeing the outlines of what had gone on, etc. And then went back to Moscow to work on the book. And then after finishing that research year, I wanted to stay another year, but the Americans didn't want me to stay. I wasn't normally and often enough visiting the American embassy, which you were supposed to do, and talking to them. I was living in Soviet society and trying to keep my distance from the Americans. So the Soviets were willing to let me stay, but I was pulled out and later questioned by the FBI and all of that about that. That was the time. And then, so, back in New York in 1966, I was a graduate student at Columbia. I began writing this dissertation, and over the next few years, we took our time in those days to write these things. And I worked with an excellent couple of mentors. One was Leopold Haemsen, the most important scholar of Bolshevism and Menshevism at the time. And most importantly, among Armenians, I worked with Nina Garsoyan. Nina Garsoyan was this exemplary model of a historian. She taught me Armenian. She didn't know spoken Armenian very well. We spoke mostly in Russian, but she taught me Eastern Armenian, and I could read the documents that I was reading in the newspapers, etc., very well. I grammatically understood Armenian. I couldn't say pass the salt, right? Because we didn't speak in Armenian. I didn't have colloquial Armenian. I had this very officious, written Armenian with big words like Hanrabetutyun or, whatever it is, Hekapokutyan and so forth, all of these kinds of things. And I wrote this book. And the interesting history of the book is that when it was sent to the press, to Princeton University Press, it was one of the first books that Princeton published about the revolution. It later became a major publisher of books on the Russian Revolution. When I sent it there was some criticism of the text, that, oh, it's too Marxist, or, it was too friendly to the Bolsheviks, and so forth. So I answered those questions, and Princeton, to its, credit, realized this is a serious study. It does fly in the face of the standard Soviet historiography of the time because it took the Soviets and it took the Bolsheviks seriously as people who were trying to make a genuine revolution, who had ambitions to create some kind of socialist society, but who were not, dyed-in-the-wool, malevolent, terroristic people. And in the book itself, I demonstrated that when the Baku, the Baku Commune, was formed in March of 1918, it never used terror to maintain its view, its rule. It basically, there was only one person killed by the regime itself, officially as a criminal, and that was some kind of thief. But there was, on the formation of that commune, when the Bolsheviks took power in the Soviet, with the help of the Dashnaksuchen, with the help of Armenian revolutionaries, remember, this is an Azerbaijani city, the capital of what is now Azerbaijan. When that happened, it was a bloody event called the March Days, in which the Armenians and the Bolsheviks defeated an uprising by Azerbaijanis, a right-wing Musavadist nationalist group, that something called the Savage Division, Dikaya Divizia, which was also interested in seizing power in the city. And then they formed this commune run by the Soviets until they stepped down from power at the end of July 1918.
Can you I have a lot of questions that come out just from what you already described. We can get to that, but can you tell us a little bit about how writing a Bolshevik-friendly dissertation and then first book in the 1960s and 70s in the US affected your career, especially in that not only are you challenging a kind of American doctrine of the time, arguably still today, but as you said, were also challenging the kind of Sovietology of the time, which is where your research would have fit in terms of studies of the Soviet Union and the United States, which was heavily orchestrated by major foundations, the CIA, the FBI at the time. How did this bear on your career?
I'm actually surprised that I survived as a young academic and so forth. And I went in 1968 after defending the dissertation at the moment of a kind of uprising at Columbia University, by the way. We were wearing red armbands and things like that at the time. Remember, this is the time of the civil rights movement and of the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War. So it was a moment of true popular questioning of American policy, right? Of the imperial policy of the United States in Vietnam, anti-communist policy. And I had had a kind of left-wing background. My grandfather, Grigor Suny, a very important Armenian ethnomusicologist, had been a member of a communist group, Armenian communist group called Haraj Dimakans, progressives in America, and had been critical of Stalin in 1937 and was thrown out of that group. His music never again played in Armenia until after Stalin's death. So I had this kind of, soft on Soviet background, questioning this Cold War orthodoxy that this is a totally malevolent regime, right? So critical of Stalinism, my views might be Marxist, but they were very critical of what the Soviet Union became under Marx, right? But always hopeful that maybe they could become a truly democratic socialist society, right? So that was the kind of orientation. It was sort of what you might call détentiste, that we don't have to demonize the Soviet Union. Remember, the 60s is a period of de-Stalinization and trying to reform the Soviet Union. The Gulag has been dismantled. The country is opening up to the West. There I am, an American in Moscow, living in a Soviet dormitory, and then in Yerevan. It's a whole very heady time when we were all young people on the left, particularly questioning those Cold War orthodoxies. We were what was called the revisionist generation. We were trying to see what we could see by being on the ground and looking carefully at what the Soviet Union was about in all of its complexities, critically, not apologetically, but not demonologically as well. So that was the point. Now, eventually when I went to Oberlin and I began talking, and now it's a time of anti-war activity, and I'm the Red-in resident on the Oberlin campus, very close to the students, attacking, basically the old establishment and Cold War orthodoxies. I was actually turned down for tenure the first time I went up for it, but eventually students and conservatives, not liberals, defended me. Conservatives understand that everything is ideology, that liberalism too is an ideology, not objectivity in science. So those kind of things complexly made it possible for me to make a career, even though I was at the edge of what could be tolerable, right? And there's a whole history that someday I'll write in a memoir, maybe, about what it was like to be a dissident in America at that time. And this might be interesting to you, Tamar and Milena, that being Armenian was important. Why? Because being Armenian in America, raised by my mother and father, with my father being very pro-Soviet, and my mother being from a more churchy, Ramgavar, liberal bourgeois family. They were tailors. They were not very wealthy. Nevertheless, that being Armenian gave me a sense of distance from being American. My grandmother would say to me, Ronald, menk hayeng, anonk Amerikatsien, anonk odaren. So in other words, we're Americans, we're Armenians, but those Americans, Amerikatsien, they're odar. They're foreigners. So I had the sense that, wait a minute, I'm born in America, but we're Armenians. We had this sense of some distance. We weren't totally American. I didn't feel any discrimination in my life until my freshman year when I went to Tufts College in Massachusetts and Yankee land and learned that I was an immigrant. I wasn't. I was born in this country, but that's what I was told. I was an immigrant by some people from New Hampshire and Massachusetts. But I had this sense that of this distance and difference. So being Armenian, I think, was an advantage in a way, right? That we are American, but we are not completely of America. And we also have a homeland. Now, this was strange because people in America, I remember distinctly certain uncles said there's no Armenia. There's no Armenia. But my father saying, no, there's Soviet Armenia. There's Hayastan. But that was something foreign and negated until I actually went there in 1964. And then again, as a graduate student in 1965, 66.
Can you can you talk a little bit about being in the Soviet Union in the 1960s? Because you said you didn't want to be extracted, and you were eventually. And you were part of a movement that wanted détente and wanted the kind of end of the Cold War and the possibility of a kind of Soviet democracy. And so can you describe that experience a little bit?
It was so complicated time, right? I remember at one point, I'm in the dormitory, we're playing ping pong, and Vietnamese students came in, and we began playing ping pong with them. They were awfully good. And I thought, oh my God, I should apologize to them for what we're doing. in Vietnam, but I didn't have the sort of guts to do that. But I made it clear that in some ways we were on the same side because by the time I got back to the United States in 1966, we were already demonstrating against the war. And I was ready to march under the Viet Cong flag. My fellow students and comrades said, no, 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 we're not for victory to the Viet Cong. We're for peace now. So we took a much more moderate stand at the time. But it was a very heady time. And I loved the Soviet Union. I would say that frankly, I loved it. I had a wonderful girlfriend there. I lived well. I was a foreigner and I could leave. I knew I could leave. I was privileged. But I thought this is such an incredibly authentic place where people read seriously on the subway, where their lives are difficult and they struggle and they think they're building something called socialism. This is still the mid 60s, not the kind of disillusion period that would follow, beginning with the intelligentsia downward in the 1970s and 80s, right? And it was a period in which Gorbachev himself was emerging. You know, he wasn't yet known, but those kind of people, they were called shestidesnyatniki, men of the people of the 60s who wanted reform and hope for the best, etc. And they would be quelled, they would be quashed during the long 17 years of Brezhnev's regime, the stagnation period. But when I was there, it was still that people believed in the system and thought it could be improved and so forth. And I had wonderful, wonderful friends there, mostly an Armenian family, the Mukherchans, many generations of them, who I knew in Yerevan, in Tbilisi, and in Moscow, and who I've written about in an interview that I gave to the Harriman Institute in 2017. I won't go into that now. So I could say, you know, frankly, I was hoping for the best. I loved the Soviet Union. I was very optimistic about the prospects, and I was never disillusioned. I was often disappointed.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Um, I think I think that part of the the forgetfulness of this history, the Baku Commune, and arguably even the history of Soviet Armenia, has a lot to do with the kind of narrative of the victor in the Cold War and all of that, and the fact that, of course, Armenians, and that's a little bit more complicated how Armenians in Armenia think about this history. And I think that also has its generational gaps. Um, but how Armenians in the diaspora, who are mostly located in North America and in Western Europe, want to kind of forget that this is actually part of our history, that some of our national heroes were part of this historical trajectory. And I've been thinking a lot actually about the Baku Commune as Armenian heritage, and there's a lot of discussion today about Armenian heritage, how we need to preserve that heritage. And of course, we know why those conversations are happening is because much of that heritage is likely currently being destroyed in Nagorno-Karabakh, and it's already been massively destroyed in Nakhichevan. But could you talk a little bit about what it would mean to kind of take the Baku Commune as Armenian heritage? If you think of this, I mean, you've written a whole history book on it, that I think you might see as part of Armenian historiography. Do you see the Baku Commune as Armenian heritage, and what would it mean to take the Baku Commune as Armenian heritage?
Yeah, you have to put yourself in a totally different frame of mind. The Caucasus, or Zakavkazia as it was called, Transcaucasia at the time, um, was one complex part of the Russian Empire. in which people moved about. Empires are about mixing and moving of peoples. So Armenians lived in Tiflis. The mayor of Tiflis, Tbilisi, in 1917 was an Armenian. They were a dominant group, the bourgeoisie in Baku. They owned industry and so forth. And Yerevan was a small town in which Armenians themselves were not very well represented. They were living in the countryside. So this was a complex thing, whereas the more privileged and intellectual layers of the Armenian people were in some of these more sophisticated cities like Baku and Tiflis. And in that complexity of that moment, in which movement, mobility, upward mobility was part of Armenian life, the working class in parts of the Caucasus were Armenian, Russian, Georgian, and Azerbaijani. And the Bolshevik Party, the Communist Party, was one of those movements that tried to unite these people and form a class alliance rather than dividing people by nationality in order to realize this imaginary that they could take power in the name of a multinational working class rather than some national bourgeoisie, right? So it's an incredible moment. And in the chaos and turmoil of the period, for a short period of time, they actually did that in Baku. So the Baku Commune, this Soviet, which ruled Baku for those few months in 1918, was in fact multinational, with Russians, Azerbaijanis, and Armenians. The leader was Armenian, but the leadership, the so-called 26 commissars, was made up of Armenians, Russians, Jews, Azerbaijanis, Georgians even, all of whom would be murdered, 26 of them, in the deserts of what is now Turkmenia or Turkestan, right? And that idea that you could have this multinational, utopian almost Caucasus was something the Bolsheviks were trying to realize against the divisiveness and division that would take place in 1918 more widely outside of Baku, when Georgians would take over Georgia. Tbilisi became a Menshevik republic, the capital of Menshevik. Armenia, that poor, wounded Armenia, became dominated by the Dashnak Sutyun, and there was resistance among Azerbaijanis against this non-Muslim government in Baku. And ultimately, this Baku Commune democratically decided at the end of July, when it lost a majority vote in the Soviet, when the non-Bolshevik parties decided we're going to invite the British to come to Baku to defend us against the Turkish army, which is moving toward the city, the Ottoman army. And the Bolsheviks stepped down. And then they tried to escape from the city on a ship and they were murdered in Turkestan. But remember, they left democratically because they had lost that vote. One of the 27th commissar, they often call him, was Anastas Mikoyan, who was left behind in prison by Shalmy and said, no, you're too young. You stay here, carry on the fight, which he did and later became an important minister of Stalin's. So you see how in an ironic and strange way, the history of Armenians was tied to what is now the capital of Baku. When Baku became Soviet, the regime there, which for a long time was also led by an Armenian named Mirzoyev, also the head of the Communist Party was for a time an Armenian in Azerbaijan. These are strange multinational, internationalist histories. A monument was built to the 26 commissars, their remains brought back from Central Asia in what I think was called Freedom Square at the time. Don't quote me on that. when Azerbaijan became an independent country and the Aliyev family took over, they dug up those regimes, those remains, and scattered them, desecrating the grave of these 26 commissars in order to erase the memory of the 20th century, of a century in which there was Soviet power and there was a different understanding of how people could live together. See? So we're back to chauvinistic nationalisms in the republics to the detriment of the kind of internationalist fervor and fever and understanding that for a moment reigned during the year of revolution. But that's the forgotten history, Tamar, that you are mentioning, that you have to bury that history because first they read it as a failure, right? Even though these nations, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, whatever their pre-Soviet histories were formed, reformed, transformed in the 20th century in the Soviet Union, made into full, conscious, coherent nations, then able to become independent, and then able to adopt this nationalism that, to their detriment, has led to conflict ever since.
Yeah. And it's really also for me reading this book, which I of course did not read in 1972 when it was published. I read it very recently, and I read it after I've read not all but many of your other books. One of the like fascinating parts of this, and it of course it's something that we know, the labor activity in this region, right? And this is also in Russia. It's not just in the Caucasus. There was immense labor activity, immense work to get workers to think about their material conditions and to become politicized, even if it was just around their own economic interests and their own economic conditions. What I found amazing was the number of the massive number of strikes that were constantly happening in Baku and around Baku in this time period, and all of the labor that went into the labor strikes and all of the work that went into getting workers to organize. There was, I think, if I'm not mistaken, there was one year in 1906 where workers spent more days not working than working, which is absolutely mind-boggling, right? In the context of today. I mean, this is a fascinating story. And I guess the question that I want to ask about that is the kind of work and the decades of work. I mean, your story starts in the 1890s. It doesn't start, in 1917 or even in 1916. It starts, far before then, because I think, of course, as a historian, you want to trace the kind of what this place and this time was like that led to the emergence of, or the foundation of, the Baku Commune. And so Sheila Fitzpatrick, who's a historian whose work I very, very much value, has written a recent book, The Shortest History of the Soviet Union, where she tells us that the Russian Revolution was in some ways easy because the conditions at the time, especially in the context of a world war, were ripe for the Bolsheviks to kind of take over and do what they did. But of course, reading your book, it becomes very clear to me that this is not the case. So if you could kind of talk about some of some of those events, those many years of organizing, of getting workers to go on strike, of workers themselves taking up the reins of their own fate, and all of this stuff. And there is also, I just want to mention, in Shahumyan's House Museum, in Stepanovan, Armenia, um, of a model of a printing of a printing press that was located far underground, underneath this old woman's house. And it's rumored, I don't know how true this is. Maybe you can answer to this, that Stalin got some of his beginnings in that printing house underneath. It was like very, very far underneath the ground. Yeah, so if you could just talk a little bit of that history before the Baku Commune.
So I'll start with that printing press and so forth. The model is probably a model of the famous secret printing press, hidden underground printing press in Avlabar. Avlabar is the Armenian area of one of the Armenian areas of Tbilisi, right across the river from the old city. And that place is still open as a museum, and you can still visit it, and it's quite extraordinary. And Stalin was involved somewhat with that press when he was an, you might say, underground revolutionary, right? It's very interesting that this history that you're talking about, this pre-revolutionary history, again, has been effaced or erased. We forget about it. The book itself, the subtitle of the book is Class and Nationality in the Russian Revolution. I might have gotten more press and more readers if I had called the book just the opposite way, Class and Nationality in the Russian Revolution, the Baku Commune, 1917-1918. I was advised to do that, but I thought, no, that's not really honest. It's really about Baku. But that's how you sell books. I'm not much of a merchandiser. I'm a very poor Armenian in that sense, not very entrepreneurial. But so the Bolshevik ambition and social democracy in general, and this goes for Mensheviks as well as Bolsheviks, and the Mensheviks were very important. They were powerful in the Georgian social democratic movement. That's why Stalin left and went to Baku, where Bolsheviks were more powerful. Their idea was that class is an important source of identity, that society is divided horizontally, and that workers of different nationalities have similar shared interests, and they will organize on the basis of those interests against those who they consider oppressors, right? And that powerful imaginary, that powerful way of thinking about struggle worked in that pre-revolutionary atmosphere. For Georgians under the Mensheviks in Georgia, where they became a very powerful movement, and even with big resonance, great resonance in the peasantry, and among the working class in Baku, which was by its nature multinational, right? And they effectively did strike over and over again. The first major labor contract after a general strike was in Baku in 1904. So this was really not only a serious example of effective class struggle on a local basis, but a model that Bolsheviks and Stalin himself thought could be replicated more widely, right? That Baku is, in a sense, an example of a multinational future that we should strive for. And to some extent, the Soviets would strive for that. But, and this is a different question, by their own nationality policy, they would move in a direction toward forming and grounding national communities, nationalities, nations within territorial states within the Soviet Federation. So that's important. What's also important is that this history now has been largely forgotten, but it was the major way of imagining the past during Soviet times. If you go to Yerevan, and Milena is there in Yerevan, you can see a wonderful monument to Stepan Shaumyan with a statue by Sergei Merkurov right around the corner from the Intourist Hotel, where Shaumyan is got his arms crossed and is about to be shot. He's looking this way. It's a beautiful statue. I go to visit. I make my pilgrimage there every time I go to Yerevan. And that monument stands. There's also other monuments to Shaumyan and to members of the Baku Commune, though the monument to Aziz Bekov, the Azerbaijani member of the Baku Commune, has been eliminated. That's been taken off its little pedestal. I think Sakharov is on that place now, or at least he was. So there's been a nationalization of the monumentalization in Yerevan as well. But that memory and that past still exists because almost more than any republic, Yerevan is a product of the Soviet Union. Armenia is a product of the Soviet Union. And it was a very loyal member of the Soviet Union. And its culture, which goes back millennia, was reinforced, relearned, and transformed in the 20th century. And that's something that it took time for Armenians to reassert and to take back. For instance, when Armenia became independent, I remember people would talk about the new independent Armenia formed in 1991 as the Second Republic. So there was a First Republic, 1918 to 1920, and then there was a Second Republic after 1991. The Soviet Republic was erased. It didn't exist. Now that's changed over time, because many of us have been saying, Babam, where were you in the 20th century? How did Armenia survive? Who built the metro? Who built the central Haraparak in Yerevan? And that history and that republic has to be brought back into as part of our legacy. And I love, Tamar, the way you put it, that our legacy extends beyond the boundaries of Armenia. Now, Azerbaijanis and Georgians don't like to hear that, but as I said, Tbilisi was a multinational city in which Armenians were not a majority, but a plurality. They were a majority, by the way, in 1850, but by 1917, they were a plurality, one of the largest groups in the city, and because they were the bourgeoisie, they were overrepresented in the city council, and the same was true in Baku, right? So, in other words, Armenians were this diaspora nation who only became territorialized in the Soviet period. When they went back to Yerevan, by default, they had to. By the way, that republic was formed, the Dashnak Republic was formed in Tiflis, because that's where the leadership was before they moved in 1918 to Yerevan. I mean, it's a complex history, more complex than even I now at an advanced age can still remember.
Wow. That's and it's like if we think about, something like if we actually transform the way in which we understand heritage and the way in which we interpret our own national history, then we actually discover a common, a shared, universal history that we have in common with various other peoples of the region. And I think a lot of the work that's being done on some of those monuments that have been lost now, at least territorially, to Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh, are also showing the same multicultural, multi-ethnic past that Armenians have always lived amongst others and have always shared and communed with others. And this new reality is actually one that bears very little resemblance to our past.
I salute that. I'm very much, I remember in the late 1990s, after some delay because we had children and Armenia and I had children and so forth, we went back to Armenia. I think it was 1997, if I remember correctly. And I gave a paper at a conference in Yerevan. Now, remember, that's the moment of war with Azerbaijan, right? So the First Karabakh War had ended and Armenians were in control of much of Karabakh. It was a very fraught time. And I gave this paper on the multinationality of Caucasian culture, intermarriage, movement, the cities. And I mentioned that the time that Yerevan in 1900 had been largely a Muslim city, for which I was pilloried and attacked. Davajanes, you're a traitor for even mentioning what were historical facts, right? Um, and it was a sensitive moment, and you know, coming sort of boldly from the West and saying, "Oh, Armenia, by the way, you're an imagined community." Well, this doesn't really fly when people are fighting and dying and cold and so forth and suffering. But it was an effort to begin to reverse this idea or change this idea that nations are concrete, organic, and antique entities that move somehow effortlessly through time, to see nations as social constructions, which has become an idea now that younger generations accept without any question. It's very interesting, but it was a struggle to get that idea across, both to my own colleagues and fellow Armenians in Armenia, as well as in the CIA, who I lectured to about this, and the State Department and the Pentagon and so forth. But it was a struggle worth fighting.
Okay, I don't think we can let you go without asking about that last part. Can you please talk about lecturing the CIA?
Yeah, I've told this story elsewhere, but it's a kind of funny story. So um, I was this marginalized Soviet historian working on a peripheral area, namely Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, right? In the 1970s and 80s, having my good time and loving it. The food is better there than anywhere else, and so forth. But Sovietology was always centered on Moscow, Leningrad, the Kremlin, top down, and I was dealing with non-Russian peoples, which was much more interesting. And as an Armenian, this was interesting to me. And so suddenly, out of nowhere, in 1988, the Karabakh question came up, and all of the media was interested in what's going on in Karabakh. What is this thing? And people started to call. So CBS News, Canadian Broadcasting called, and so forth. And one day at my mother's house in Philadelphia, the phone rings. How they knew I was there, I don't know. And they said, "Professor Suny, we would like you to come to Washington to talk to us." And I said, "Well, who are you?" They said, "We're the Central Intelligence Agency." And I said, "Really? You want me to come and talk to you? Do you know anything about me?" And they said, "We know all about you." So I thought, "Oh, that's interesting." I said, "Well, I have to go back to Ann Arbor, and I want to talk to my comrades, I mean my colleagues, and see if I can, if they think it's a good idea." Of course, when I came home, all of my friends said, "Of course you should go and talk to them. You're a citizen of this country. The CIA and the government's been listening to all these right-wingers all these years. They ought to listen to other points of view. You know something about the Soviet Union." So they flew me to Washington, and we went through a kind of bank vault into this area and sat down. And they said, "Professor Suny, can you tell us what's going on?" and so forth. And I'm not kidding you, Tamar and Milena. Here's how I began. I said, "The Cold War must finally be over when the CIA asks a Marxist to tell them about the Soviet Union." No one laughed. The CIA doesn't have a great sense of humor, by the way. But they listened, and I was asked for many years after that to talk to these various agencies, the Foreign Service Institute, something at the Pentagon, the State Department, I can't remember all these different places, about what was going on, until other experts were developed and other people took over and ran with that. But it was a very heady time, my 15 minutes of fame, and hopefully some contribution in trying to convince people that these nationalist struggles are not ancient tribal struggles, but political struggles over real issues in the contemporary world. And if that's true, maybe it's going to be difficult to deconstruct all that's been constructed, but maybe we can reconstruct some of it and move on beyond all of this, national and chauvinistic hatred of one another. Because, Armenia lives in a dangerous neighborhood. Azerbaijanis don't love us. They'd love to have parts of Armenia. Turks are on the other side, and they have, their own antagonisms towards us. Georgians are less than reliable, sadly, at the moment, though there are people I love dearly. My family is from Georgia. And there we are, stuck, there in this rocky, uh, inhospitable place that somehow Armenians miraculously have turned into a kind of refuge. And with a dynamic civil society, I say this often, and to the most democratic state in the region. So all the pessimism and all the darkness with enemies on the frontier that seems to exist, really, for Armenians and this dynamic society, don't lead me to despair or to pessimism, but to optimism, because look where we've come from and look what we've survived. And we do have this. Sorry, go ahead.
I wouldn't say it's the civil society that gives me hope. It's the non-civil society that gives me more hope in
What's the
this.
non-civil society?
It's just the people. Like, it's not people that belong to institutions. It's people that don't belong to institutions that gives me
Oh,
more hope here than the people who belong to institutions.
I think that's perfectly fair. And you're in Sito, you're there. What I observe when I go, and I've been there the last three summers, um, is the openness of people, ordinary and also institutionalized, the intelligence of the discussions, the silliness too of the discussions sometimes, particularly from the top, but still, I mean, the vibrancy and the fearlessness with people talk about things. That makes me optimistic. But then I've always been optimistic because optimism is something that's characteristic of the left. Pessimism and cynicism leads to the right. So, onward, period, araj, araj.
Yes. Um, Thank you so much.
My
I
pleasure.
don't know if Milena, if there's anything you want to add, or Ron, if there's more you want to say about the book.
No, thank you so much for this opportunity. The book is now, I don't know, look how old it is. And I'm so happy that people are
So
still
it's all
reading it.
torn. All of the so it's a hardback that I got. I had to search far and wide for it. It wasn't easy to find. I think that there should be a reprint.
Thank
Um,
you. Thank you. Yes, I'd love it. Uh, yeah, no, I've moved, into other areas too because I'm writing still about nationalism and so forth. But I just learned that my book on the genocide, which has been translated into Turkish and Armenian and Hungarian, has been translated also into Russian, but I haven't seen it yet. So I'm happy that there's some resonance out there, and I'm so grateful to the Armenians who translated it into Armenian, since that's the most important audience of all.
yes. We would love to have you on again. To talk about so many other things. Thank you so much
My
for
pleasure.
talking to us today. Um, please, those who are listening, like, subscribe, comment, share, find us on other podcast apps. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
And please send me a link to this wonderful interview.
Of
We
course.
will.
Bye now. Keep
Bye-bye.
well.
Bye.
Bye bye.